Hi, everyone. Welcome to all of you on the line, and thank you for joining today's webinar, State of the Science, What You Need to Know About Climate Change and Land. I'm Sarah McCracken, a Manager of Investor Engagement at Ceres, and I'll be moderating our discussion today. Before we begin the discussion, I want to go over a couple of logistical items first. All participants are currently in listen-only mode. We do encourage questions, and they will be answered at the end of all of our presenters' discussions. So as you have questions, please use the chat function to send them to us. Today's webinar is being recorded, and a recording will be made available to you. And you can join the audio for today's call through computer or by phone. And if you're joining by phone, please do use the information that's available on the screen to log in. We have ReadyTalk customer support on the line to help with any questions that you have regarding the audio or the web platform. So please do use the chat box to contact them if you need any support throughout the discussion. Now, before we begin, I know that many of you on the line are familiar with Ceres, but to those of you who are welcoming to our webinars for the first time, we just want to give a quick overview of our organization. Ceres is a sustainability nonprofit working with the most influential investors and companies to build leadership and to drive solutions throughout the economy. At Ceres, we work with leading investors to accelerate the transition to a sustainable global economy while enhancing the bottom line. We inspire the most influential investors and companies to integrate environmental, social, and governance practices into core business strategies and seize the opportunities embedded in the transition to a low-carbon economy. Today on this discussion, you'll hear from several experts in the field who will discuss important updates in the state of the science and what you need to know about climate change and land. First, we'll hear from Meryl Richards, a Senior Manager of Food and Forests at Ceres. Meryl has a research background in mitigation of agricultural greenhouse gas emissions, and her work was cited in the IPCC Land Report. Meryl will be speaking to 4 key points that all investors and companies on the line should know related to climate change and land. Second, we'll hear from Tek Sapkota, Agricultural Systems and Climate Change Scientist with the International Maize and Wheat Improvement Center, abbreviated CIMMYT on your screen. Tek was a lead author on the IPCC Land Report and will discuss the implications of that critical report. And finally, we'll hear from Tim Searchinger, Senior Fellow at the World Resources Institute and Research Scholar and Lecturer at Princeton University, who will be discussing how we can move toward a sustainable future for food. And I'll now introduce our first speaker. Again, Meryl Richards is a Senior Manager of Food and Forests at Ceres, where she collaborates with investors and companies to address deforestation and climate change in global supply chains. Meryl leads research on the climate change impacts of agriculture and commodity-driven deforestation and how food companies can reduce the material risks associated with those impacts. Meryl, I'll turn the discussion over to you.
Thank you, Sarah. So again, good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining this webinar. I'm really excited to talk to you about climate change and land this morning. I'm sure most of you are aware that according to the most recent IPCC report on climate change and land, humans currently use more than 70% of ice-free land. The way that we use that land is dramatically altering our climate, which in turn is further impacting the ability of the land to produce food and fiber to sustain our increasing global population. Interactions between land and climate will affect not only food companies, but any businesses that rely on land and water resources. There are 4 key messages about the interaction between climate change and land that I hope you take away from this webinar. First, the effects of climate change on land will exacerbate existing physical risks to businesses that rely on the land and water resources through more frequent droughts, floods, and heat events. Second, land use is a major contributor to climate change, but land is also a large part of the solution. And finally, companies can and must address land-based climate risks. So first, climate change will exacerbate physical risks. Tech will provide more details on these risks from the IPCC land report, but the truth is that climate change already is exacerbating risks, especially water risks. WRI's updated Aqueduct Water Risk Atlas finds that 17 countries, which are home to a quarter of the world's population, already face extremely high water stress. In countries facing extremely high water stress, agriculture, industry, and municipalities are using up to 80% of available surface and groundwater in an average year. When demand rivals supply at this level, even small dry shocks, which are set to increase under climate change, can produce dire consequences. As an example of this, droughts are material risks for many companies. And in 2018, a drought in Argentina decreased soy production by 31% and corn production by 20% compared to the previous season. Unfortunately, the drought in Argentina also happened to coincide with a drought in Europe. And the combined effects were that corn prices rose 14% and soy prices rose 8%, decreasing operating income for U.S. meat producers. Both Sanderson Farms and Tyson cited the drought in Argentina and the drought in Europe as a cause of increased costs and decreased operating income. For more on water risks, in October, Ceres will be releasing the latest update to Feeding Ourselves Thirsty, a benchmarking of the water risk management of 40 of the largest U.S.-based food and beverage companies. The analysis examines the financial materiality of water risks for the food sector and highlights water risk management leaders and laggards. So look for that report coming out in October. To my second point, land use is also a major contributor to climate change. Land and water resources will be dramatically affected by climate change, but the way we use land also matters. According to the new IPCC land report, agriculture, forestry, and other land use, often abbreviated as AFLU, contribute about 23% of global anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions, second only to the energy sector. Tech will go into more detail here, but about half those emissions are directly from agricultural production. The other half are from land use change, primarily conversion of forests to tropical crops such as palm plantations, pasture, soy, and other agricultural uses. The good news is that according to Global Forest Watch, tropical forest loss declined in 2018. The bad news, however, is that we still lost 3.6 million hectares of old-growth tropical rainforest, an area that's about the size of Belgium. And we're still losing forests at a rate even higher than our historical average since 2002. The two hotspots of commodity-driven deforestation are Indonesia and Brazil. In Indonesia, where forest loss is primarily driven by palm oil cultivation, the rate of forest loss declined 40% in 2018 compared to the average annual loss from 2002 to 2016. So this is heartening, and it's potentially due to the combined effects of strengthened law enforcement as well as a moratorium on clearing primary forest and peatlands on 66 million hectares. That moratorium was introduced in 2011 and recently made permanent. However, the news from Brazil, the other hotspot of tropical forest loss, is more mixed. Forest loss in Brazil is driven primarily by cattle ranching and soy production for animal feed. While primary forest loss in 2018 was lower than a 2016 to 2017 spike, it still remained elevated after progress that was made between 2002 and 2015. And as I'm sure many of you know, the news in 2019 is not promising. Brazil's Space Research Agency detected almost 80,000 fires this year. Around half of those were in the Amazon, and that's an 84% increase over last year. By some estimates, deforestation in June alone was 80% higher than June of last year. So while Indonesia and Brazil are the hotspots for commodity-driven tropical forest loss, new frontiers of forest loss are also emerging in parts of Africa. For example, Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire experienced the highest rise in primary forest loss between 2017 and 2018 of any tropical country. Though it's unknown exactly the cause of those losses, and much of it may be caused by mining, but at least some is likely due to the expansion of cocoa farms. So these are areas to watch over the next several years. So we know that land is a driver of climate change, but it's also a large part of the solution. And I'm sure many of you have heard the term nature-based solutions or natural climate solutions. And indeed, the new IPCC land report makes clear that not only can land be part of the solution, it must be part of the solution. All of the modeled pathways that limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius require land-based mitigation. Peck and Tim will both more thoroughly describe the various options for land-based mitigation, especially within our food system. But I want to make one point that explains why I say that land is part of the solution. The options for land-based mitigation vary in their effectiveness and their potential trade-offs with food production. One of the most effective options with immediate impact is reducing or eliminating deforestation and forest degradation. It doesn't have any trade-offs with the other objectives that were evaluated in the land report, such as food security and adaptation. Crop and livestock management, as well as dietary changes and reducing food loss and waste, have medium or large mitigation potential, also without significant trade-offs. However, some options, such as reforestation and afforestation and bioenergy crops, while having large mitigation potential, also have limits to their potential. According to the land report, there are limits to the deployment of land-based mitigation measures, such as bioenergy crops or afforestation. Widespread use, we're talking the scale of several millions of square kilometers globally, could increase risks for desertification, land degradation, food security, and sustainable development. So this is why I say that land is part of the solution. There are limits to our ability to sequester carbon to offset emissions. We must reduce our emissions first, and that includes keeping standing forests intact. Last year, the IPCC 1.5 degree report dramatically shifted the global conversation on climate action, leading to pressure on companies to follow a 1.5 degree pathway for their emissions. The conversation about how to reach that target has already started to shift towards the discussion about agriculture and forests, following the publication of a 2017 article in Natural Climate Solutions, and I think the land report will only reinforce that. So what can companies do, and what are the conversations that investors can be having with companies about climate and land? I'll highlight a few things now, and Sarah will follow up at the very end with some concrete next steps. First, investors should know that for food and beverage companies especially, exposure to land-based greenhouse gas emissions exists primarily in the supply chain. A Ceres review of the 50 top food and beverage companies in the United States found that 89% of their emissions came from Scope 3 emissions, primarily from purchased goods and services. However, only about half of the reviewed companies disclosed Scope 3 emissions, so getting a handle on Scope 3 emissions is the first step. Second, many companies are starting to set science-based targets, and it's important that those targets include Scope 3 emissions. And one thing to be aware of on the horizon is that while land use change, such as deforestation, historically has not been part of those targets because of a lack of methodology, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol team at WRI is scoping a guidance for land use change that may inform how science-based targets are defined for the food and beverage sectors. Because a large proportion of the emissions embedded in certain food commodities are the result of deforestation, there really is an opportunity for deforestation targets to deliver against climate targets. Lastly, investors can be engaging companies on how ambitious scenarios for climate change mitigation are informing their strategies. There's an emerging trend amongst millennials, everyone loves to talk about millennials, to adopt more environmentally conscious practices, according to a new CDP report. Leading companies are responding to these trends through the acquisition of small brands, but more transformative innovation and shifts in business models may be needed to align with targets set by the Paris Agreement. So are companies thinking about dietary changes and reducing food waste, and how some of the really innovative solutions that Tech and Tim will discuss can be part of their business models? So to summarize, to address land-based risks posed by climate change, companies can first anticipate and address the potential impacts of climate change on land and especially on water resources. Second, eliminate deforestation from their supply chains. Third, quantify Scope 3 emissions and set science-based targets. and then support their producers to implement climate change mitigation practices to meet those targets. And lastly, consider how to adapt to changing consumer preferences and incorporate some of the really innovative climate change mitigation solutions that are coming out of the scientific community. Thanks. Back to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Meryl. That was a fantastic overview and a great way to start our discussion today. Now I'd like to introduce our second speaker, Tek Sapkota. Tek works in the Sustainable Intensification Program of the International Maize and Wheat Improvement Center as a climate change and agricultural systems scientist. He's a lead author of the IPCC Special Report on Climate Change and Land. Tek has over 15 years of experience in strategic research in the area of agriculture and climate interface, and has authored over 30 journal articles, book chapters, and popular articles on sustainable agriculture, climate change, and food security. Tek, I'll turn the discussion over to you.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you very much. Thanks for the nice introduction. And thank you to Meryl as well for setting up the context for me. You made my job easier to summarize this IPCC special report on climate change and land. Just a brief background of this report. This report is based on the assessment of over 7,000 studies involving about 107 scientists coming from 52 different countries. Next slide, please. Thank you. As we all know, that land is under a constant pressure to feed increasing and affluent population. As you can see from the left figure in the slide, that the total population, prevalence of the overweight and obese people, and total calorie consumption has been increased significantly over the time. In response, as you can see on the right figure in the slide, that the food production, fertilizer and water consumption, and the number of livestock had also increased tremendously with time. However, one thing is to be noted that despite increasing food production over time, it is estimated that about 0.8 billion people are still undernourished today, and about 2 billion adults are overweight or obese. Next slide, please. The problem is further exacerbated by the climate change, as climate systems and food systems interact in a complex way as shown in the figure. Let's start with the food system, which is the bigger circle in the figure. The components of the food system involve food production and supply, food processing, transport and marketing, food consumption, and management of food loss and food waste. And all of these directly affect the availability, access, utilization, and stability of the food, thus directly affecting the food security on the right circle in the figure. The component of the climate system, the top circle on the other hand, through the effect of temperature, precipitation, and occurrence of extreme events, may impact various components of the food system, both positively as well as negatively. And further, the way that we manage various components of the food system, from production, transport, marketing, up to consumption, can directly and indirectly affect climate change adaptation as well as mitigation. So that's why the interaction between climate change and food system is inevitable. Now let's next slide, please. Now let's look at the impact of climate change on the food system. The change in the climatic system undermines the food production through increased surface mean temperature by increasing the frequency of extreme rainfall and other extreme events, drought, and so on. And these events can impact the crop production, increases the food prices, and also disturbs the food distribution. So that will directly impact the food security. You can see from the figure that the global mean surface temperature over the land surface has always been higher then the global mean surface temperature, that is average of land and ocean. And that has tremendous effect on various aspects of land and food security. Next slide, please. The figure in this slide shows the effect of increased global mean surface temperature relative to pre-industrial level, shown in the y-axis. This is a little bit dense figure. So effect of that increased temperature in the processes involved in desertification, as shown by the water scarcity, first bar. The processes involved in land degradation, shown as soil erosion, vegetation loss, wildfire damage, and permafrost thaw, shown by the subsequent bars, and the processes involved in food security, for example, shown by the crop yield decline and food supply instability, shown by the last two bars. Please note that the effect of the increased temperature on these processes are color-coded, and where yellow color means the effect of temperature is low, red color means high effect, and the purple color means extreme effect. And the letter L, M, and H in the bar denotes the level of confidence for the from transition of one effect to another. So, and then the effect of temperature on these processes also drives the risk at various systems such as food, livelihood, human and ecosystem health, infrastructure, and value of land, as denoted by the dots just below the respective bars. So the key message out of this figure is increase in temperature can affect all the aspects of land degradation, desertification, and food security. Next slide, please. So these are the effects of climate change so far on food system. Let's see the effect of food system on climate change. As Meera has already highlighted, that the food system as a whole is a major driver of climate change, as it contributes to 1/3 of the anthropogenic greenhouse gas emission. Meera said that a full factor accounts for 23% of the total anthropogenic greenhouse gas emission. But when you talk about the food system, which involves not only production but also processing, transport, retail, consumption, and management of food loss and waste, altogether it accounts for 1/3 of total global anthropogenic greenhouse gas emission, which ranges from 21 to 37%. Therefore, the land-based solutions are very, very important steps for tackling the climate change. This special report of IPCC. Next slide, please. So this special report of IPCC on climate change and land summarizes the land-based solutions to tackle climate change and food security through the actions in 4 major areas. They are avoiding, reducing, and reversing deforestation, land degradation, and desertification, improving the efficiency of food production through more proactive use of land, water, nutrient, and other production resources, consumption of healthy and sustainable diets based mainly on plant sources, and minimizing the animal source food, and minimizing the food loss and food waste. Next slide, please. So my subsequent slide will present the concrete action that can be taken under each of these 4 areas. Now, in terms of avoiding, reducing, and reversing deforestation, land degradation, and desertification, we should focus on conservation of high carbon ecosystems such as peatland, woodland, rangeland, mangroves, and forest. The actions such as water harvesting, micro-irrigation, restoring degraded land, ecosystem restoration services, and afforestation, for example, building green walls to reduce dust storm, can be very helpful in stopping land degradation and desertification. These activities would also enhance soil fertility, increase the carbon storage in the soil and biomass, while benefiting agricultural productivity and food security. Next slide, please. There are a whole lot of practices that make our production system more productive, more efficient, and climate friendly, such as improved fertilizer management through adoption of various precision nutrient management practices, improved crop management practices including conservation agriculture, paddy rice water management, genetic improvement of crops as well as livestock for high yield tolerance and climate change adaptation and lower greenhouse gas emission, improving grazing land management and manure management, improve food quality for the livestock, and diversification of the food production system based on the local production system and dietary choices. The consumption of the healthy and sustainable diet made up of higher portion of the coarse grains, pulses, fruits and vegetables, and nuts and seeds, and low in energy intensive animal-based food can definitely be one of the solutions for climate change mitigation. However, achieving the full mitigation potential through this approach is a little challenging due to current production practices, technical and financial barriers, and also cultural practices and associated livelihood for the associated farmers. So minimizing, next slide please. So minimizing the food loss and waste offers a great opportunity for the climate change mitigation, as food loss and waste are associated with the release of 8 to 10% of the total anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. The statistics shows that about 25 to 30% of the food produced globally is lost during production and supply and wasted during consumption. Food loss and waste lowers the income for producers, increases price for consumers, and lead to the unsustainable use of natural resources. There are two approaches to reduce food loss and waste, technical and non-technical. The technical method involves improving the harvesting, on-farm storage, infrastructure, packaging to keep the food fresher, and refrigeration, whereas non-technical methods involve changing behavior and attitude to minimize the food losses and redistribution of the food from the food surplus area. So let me conclude my part of the presentation by with this take-home message. So the message is keeping the global warming well below 1.5 degrees centigrade is only possible by reducing emission from all the sectors. That is not new. However, this special report highlights that since the focus has always been on energy, industry, and transportation, but based on the assessment that we have done on this special report, the better land management can also play its part, and the action on land is inevitable to tackling climate change. Many of these land management response to climate change can also combat desertification and land degradation and enhance food security and contribute to many of the sustainable development goals. And the important thing is many of these land-based solutions are already in use, so we don't have to make a lot of research and technical innovations, but all we have to do is widespread the implementation of these solutions. Therefore, policies that support sustainable land management and ensure food supplies for the vulnerable populations and keep carbon on the ground while reducing greenhouse gas emissions are important steps to meet the target set under Paris Agreement. Thank you. I stop here and I hand over to Sarah, please.
Thank you, Tech. That was a really important overview of the recent IPCC land report, and we're pleased to see that there have been a number of questions that have come in so we can discuss this further at the end of all of our presentations. So to everyone on the line, please do continue to send in your questions, and we will address those at the conclusion of the presentation. Now I want to introduce our final speaker today, Tim Searchinger. Tim is a senior fellow at the World Resources Institute and a lead author of the World Resources Report, Creating a Sustainable Food Future. He is also a research scholar and lecturer at the Woodrow Wilson School of Princeton University. Although trained as a lawyer, Tim's work today combines ecology and economics to analyze the challenge of how to feed a growing world population while reducing deforestation and greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture. Tim, I'll turn the microphone over to you.
Thanks very much. Can everyone hear me? Yeah.
We can hear you well.
Okay. So thanks very much. We put out our own kind of 600-page report in July with the World Resources Institute, with the World Bank and the UN. And for those who, obviously it goes into a lot of detail, I'm only going to touch on a couple of issues here. But there is a synthesis report that you can find at this website as well as the longer version, and I encourage you to look at that. And because we're not the IPCC, in some ways we're allowed to offer opinions on the differences in science and perhaps be a little bit more explanatory to the layman, as well as to get a little more into policy. So you may find some things there you don't see in the IPCC report. Next slide. So the big challenge, next slide please. The big challenge that we're facing, and it really can't be overstated, is that the world basically needs to produce about 50% more food between 2010 and 2050 because of the rising population and wealthier population. But to meet climate change targets, it needs to reduce the likely emissions by 2/3. So by 2050, even if we're able to achieve the typical productivity gains we have historically, greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture and land use change alone would be about 70% of the allowable emissions from all human sources. And that's even though agriculture would only be about 2% of GDP. So for agriculture to do its fair share, it's got to reduce its emissions by 2/3. And a big part of that, some of that is production emissions from the production process, but a big part is from land use. And even if we maintain our historic rate of yield gains, we estimate that there would have to be a clearing of about 600 million hectares of land. And meanwhile, almost all climate solutions actually require not just that we not clear more forest and savanna, but that we actually reduce the agricultural area by hundreds of millions of hectares and in some way reforest or otherwise use that land for climate mitigation. So that is a huge challenge, and one of the implications of that is every hectare of land is extremely important. Every hectare of land that we avoid using for agriculture is another hectare of land that can store carbon in forests, and that's a very big factor. So one of the points, we go on to the next slide, I'm just going to hit on a few of the major findings. So this slide I'll pass over, but we come up with a 22 menu item solution in 5 categories. I'll let you read those. It's sustainably reducing demand, it's increasing food productivity on the same hectare, it's using those gains in productivity to protect forests, which is not automatic, and it's reducing emissions from the production process. We also have something on fish. But let me focus on four key points. Next slide, please. So one of them is that we are strong advocates of the need to curb consumption of ruminant meat, beef, lamb, goat meat. And ruminants are responsible for about half of all the greenhouse gas emissions from the agricultural production system. And they're responsible for more than half of all the land use change. But they produce actually a very small amount of the calories, and particularly ruminant meat. So ruminant meat, as I'll show you in the U.S. diet, is almost half of all the greenhouse gas emissions, half of all the land use requirements, but provides only 3% of the calories. And if you look at this slide, what I want to focus you on is the bottom slide. And it shows that the greenhouse gas consequences, if you look at the yellow and orange bar at the bottom, the greenhouse gas consequences of beef are dramatically higher than all other animal products and much, much higher than all other plant-based products. And the key, the one you want to focus on, the part of the line you want to focus on is the lighter yellow line at the bottom, because most of those greenhouse gas consequences are because of the amount of land that is devoted to it. And that means land that is not used for forest. So while ruminants do use a lot of waste biomass from other agriculture, and while there are native grazing lands, 40% of all the grazing land in the world was historically forest. We keep clearing forests to produce more beef. That's what's going on in the Amazon a lot right now. And grazing area is about 2/3 of all the world's agricultural land. So we have to reduce the amount of land, not increase, but reduce the amount of land devoted to beef, even as the likely increases in demand for beef are around 80% globally. And to do that, and you can read about this, basically the average American, only about 1/4 of the world's population eats a lot of beef or lamb. And that part of the population has to reduce its consumption under any scenario that we can come up with to reach the target by 50%, which for the average American means eating the equivalent of a hamburger and a half per week as opposed to 3 hamburgers per week. Next slide, please. And this is a slide that communicates that it's only 3% of calories in the U.S., almost half of the emissions. It's all the stuff in red. If you go on to the next slide. Another thing we have to avoid is bioenergy. So unfortunately, probably one of the main things that governments have done in theoretical response to climate change has actually been adverse, which is to encourage the use of bioenergy. And bioenergy requires, some bioenergy is from waste biomass, but most of it comes from diverting the productive capacity of land, either from food production or forests, into energy use. And the problem is it's extraordinarily inefficient. So the most efficient biofuel we have in the world today is sugarcane ethanol, because it's a perennial plant grown on highly productive land, and it converts only 0.2% of the energy in the sun into usable energy. And a PV cell, just by contrast today, would give you 20% on a gross basis and maybe 14, 15% on a net basis. So what that means is that even on the best agricultural land, which is where you get the best results for bioenergy, you more or less get 100 times more usable energy if you wanted to use that land for a solar method of converting sun into usable energy rather than a bioenergy. And what that means is if we can spare land, it also means, if you go on to the next slide, that in general, because on most of the world's land you can produce at least 100 times more usable energy using solar techniques than bioenergy, that if you could spare 100 hectares of land from food production, if you were to use 1 for solar and reforest 99, you can get the same amount of energy and 100 times more usable energy at least. And in fact, that understates it because solar does not require good land. Next slide, please. So one of the basic errors here, I'll just make it quickly, was a belief that something that is renewable is free. So the idea is you have a tree, you can cut it down, you can burn it, the tree regrows, you can burn your tree and have it too, and that means that essentially it is free to use. But the problem is that land is a limited resource. And if you want to think about something that is also renewable but not free, you can think of your own paychecks. So you get a paycheck this month, you get a paycheck next month. But if somebody says to you, hey, give me your paycheck, it's not going to cost you anything. You'd realize that actually you're using your paycheck, and if you give it to somebody else, the cost is not using it for food, rent, or putting it in the bank. And the same is true of plant growth. The mere fact that plant growth is renewable doesn't mean we can divert it from food and carbon storage and forests without cost. Next slide, please. Another part of the report is that a major theme is therefore decreasing the amount of land use we require for agriculture. And there have been studies that have, in effect, treated a whole large category of land that is called other as though it were free to use. Other meaning land that is not forest, it's not agriculture today. But that other land is actually tropical savannas mostly. And you can see pictures of some of tropical savanna on the right. And clearing tropical savannas also has a large carbon cost, also has huge biodiversity implications. We really don't have any surplus land. There are small areas that are underutilized, and we need to use them better, whether better for food production or better for forest. But there really isn't a reservoir of spare land. Next slide. So another part of the theme, though, is that not only do we have to hold down consumption, we need to increase productivity, meaning we need to produce more food for each use of natural resources. Now that means both more food per hectare, more food per unit of fertilizer, more food per animal. And in this graphic, what you see, I don't know, somehow, if you look at the fourth column from the right, from the left, the fourth column to the right, we analyze using our model how much greenhouse gas emissions would be in 2050 if we tried to produce all the food needed in 2050 with today's agricultural production systems. And the answer was about 38 gigatons, which is roughly twice as much as the allowable emissions from all human sources. And that just illustrates that continuing to make yield gains, continuing to increase the productivity of livestock production is critical, and a lot of those opportunities are in developing worlds. And so that a major, major focus of our report is simply how do you increase the productivity of agriculture, which reduces the land use footprint per ton of food, reduces the emissions per ton of food. If you go to the next slide, that even though that is critical, next slide please, yeah. Oh, by the way, so then a big part of this, again with the focus on beef, is that actually a huge part of the productivity gain we need is in grazing land. So people tend to think about cropland productivity, and that's important too, but actually 2/3 of the world's agricultural land is grazing land. And even if we hold down our demand for beef and milk, we're still going to need to get double or triple the output per hectare of grazing land on every hectare of the world's grazing land that is potentially improvable. That primarily it focuses now on Latin America and Africa, and there are ways to improve grazing that gets a fraction of the attention. It doesn't get the resources. It needs investment. It can be profitable. One thing we desperately need is to have better vehicles for directing financing into these very real opportunities to improve the efficiency of grazing. Next slide, please. So by the way, a key point here, this is too complicated to explain in detail, but one way to think about it is we need every hectare of land to produce at its highest and best use. And so we had a paper talk about, we had a paper in Nature that provided a quantitative method for evaluating whether an improvement is, what is the best use of land. And in this paper, which I won't go into great detail, we showed, or we calculated, that actually improving the efficiency of grazing in the Brazilian Cerrado to a very reasonable level was even more valuable than reforesting that land, because what it would do is it would spare that much more land resources elsewhere that could be used to protect forest. So this is, again, this emphasis that productivity gains are really important. Next slide, please. But another part of this problem is that just increasing productivity doesn't necessarily protect forests. Because one thing that's been underestimated or underfocused on is that agriculture is also shifting from one place to another. So here in this slide, you see in Latin America, the blue is reforestation, and the red is deforestation that occurred in the decade from 2000 to 2010, roughly. And so one of the messages, and this is also happening globally, where we're reforesting land in the north and deforesting land in the south. And there are a couple of lessons from that. One lesson from that is that actually abandoned agricultural land is a very valuable resource. So for example, in Indonesia, while it is true that it is great that the amount of deforestation of primary forest has gone down, even when you decide to turn into a palm plantation a hectare of land that had already been deforested, that's a hectare of land that probably would come back as secondary forest. And that still has a cost. It's better than the alternative, but it's not as good as holding down the total footprint of agricultural demand. So that's one lesson, is that abandoned land is very valuable, and we need to bring that back as good forest. But the other lesson is, unfortunately, that shifting is more costly than the benefit, because what we're clearing is primary forest, higher carbon, and higher biodiversity effects. So it's not an equal trade. So one thing we want to do is reduce the shifting of agricultural land. And the next slide, this is one of the most important recommendations, is that one of the challenges is that while it's critical to increase yields, because you can't produce, by definition, 50% more food on the same land without 50% more yields, it's also true that when you increase yields, often in developing countries, it becomes more economical to expand land there. So this is a slide that shows how in Brazil, even as soybean yields increased, soybean area expanded. And that while it probably saved some forest elsewhere, it cleared a primary forest in Brazil. And so the only recommendation there we have is the critical recommendation is that the two need to be linked. It's critical both to boost yields and to make sure that those yield gains protect forests, and that changes, in our view, the obligation for international food companies. It's not enough just to not buy from land that was explicitly cleared for forests. So in other words, I buy from my soybeans from land that was cleared 20 years ago as opposed to land that was cleared last year. That's not enough. What needs to happen is companies need to work with their suppliers both to boost yields on existing land and to avoid forest clearing. So there's something called the jurisdictional approach that is basically trying to do that in large areas, and that's the kind of thing that we think private food companies need to be involved in. Next slide, please. And then the last, well, I'll make two more points. One point is that broadly, there's this broad category of production emissions. And most of those emissions, only a small part of those emissions are energy. Most of them are microbial. They're methane and nitrous oxide that are produced in these 5 categories: enteric methane in stomachs, rice fields, and from the application of nitrogen manure management. And there are techniques that can reduce these emissions. But one of the things we found in the report is that there are important opportunities for innovation in each of these areas that could do much better and reduce the cost. And we need to push those forward. So it's critical that investment be made in these opportunities for innovation. We also are in favor of flexible regulation that actually creates markets so that companies know that if they in fact develop techniques that cost effectively can reduce these emissions, they'll be able to sell them. Next slide. So one thing we also would caution against, and scientists disagree about this, but we do not believe that soil carbon sequestration in existing agricultural lands has much real mitigation potential. It's not that it's not valuable, but it's much, much harder to do than people estimate. And we have a long chapter on that, and people can look at that. And in fact, the countries that are seriously trying to mitigate their emissions, like Denmark or Ireland or New Zealand, really are not focusing on that because they know it's not real. They're focusing much more on ruminants and things like that. But there is a huge category of emissions that is relatively cheap for the grabbing. And that is that about 0.5% of all the world's agricultural land is drained peatlands. And peatlands are these very carbon-rich lands, and once you drain them, like these lands in Southeast Asia turn into palm plantations, once you drain them, they continue to emit carbon year after year after year at extremely high levels. And about half of those peatlands are probably in limited agricultural use, and restoring them, re-wetting them would keep that carbon in. And that's a critical priority. These peatlands are 2% of all global emissions of all human sources, even though that's not agricultural sources, all human sources, even though they are only 0.5% of the world's agricultural land. So I think that's my last slide. Is there another one? No, I think that's it. Yeah, and so I just encourage you to read our report. We're happy to engage in discussion with anybody else, anybody on this call who wants to email me. We hope the report can be of use, and thank you very much.
Tim, thank you so much for that overview, and thank you also to Tech and to Meryl for all of the information that we've covered today. I do see that we have a number of questions in the chat box that we will get to in just a moment, but I do want to first go through some next steps, and again, Meryl has highlighted some of these as well as Tech and Tim, but things that investors and companies on the line should be thinking about building on this discussion. So both investors and companies have roles to play in addressing the risks that we've discussed on our webinar today. Investors should analyze their portfolios for risks related to deforestation and water. Investors can engage with companies on addressing deforestation-related risks and water-related risks. Investors can also join collaborative shareholder engagements, and on the next slide I'll go into more detail about those opportunities to engage on those key issues through Ceres. Companies on the line who are looking to address risks in their supply chain should be setting and disclosing goals as well as their progress toward goals. Increased traceability and disclosure are critical. And as already referenced above, stakeholder engagement is a key part of a company's progress towards improvement. Additionally, companies should be setting science-based targets and strategies to meet those targets. And finally, companies should develop no deforestation policies to address market, legal, and reputational risk. We've highlighted a number of those risks on the Ceres website, engagethechain.org. Our recent research report, Out on a Limb, shows the current gap between companies with forest risk exposure and companies reporting quantitative progress on policies and goals to address deforestation in their supply chains. Companies should actively seek to address risks by developing strong no deforestation policies and by regularly disclosing progress on their commitments. And Meryl, I'd ask you to move me on to the next slide if you can, please. So there are several opportunities to engage within Ceres, and I'll highlight a few of them before we move into our Q&A. The Shareholder Initiative for Climate and Sustainability, or SIX, offers investors the opportunity to engage on many land use change and agriculture-related issues. Through investor dialogues and shareholder resolutions, investors through SIX are engaging with companies to address impacts on land, forests, and water. Next, the Investor Initiative for Sustainable Forests is a joint initiative led by Ceres and PRI, which aims to transform industry practices to eliminate deforestation from cattle and soy supply chains. You'll see our Investor Water Hub on the slide. Ceres Water Program prioritizes work with the food sector. The Investor Water Hub, which is a group of over 100 investors representing more than $20 trillion in assets under management, undertakes activities to help drive greater consideration of water in investment decision making. Ceres and the Investor Network FAIR have coordinated a group of 80 investors with more than $6.5 trillion in assets under management to publicly urge the 6 largest U.S. fast food companies to address exposure to climate and water risks associated with their meat and dairy supply chains. Last, on your screen, you'll see Climate Action 100+, which is a 5-year initiative that is led by investors to engage systematically important greenhouse gas emitters and other companies across the global economy that have significant opportunities to drive the clean energy transition and help achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement. If you do have any questions on how you can get more involved in these opportunities, please do contact us after the webinar. Meryl, if you could move us on to the next slide, we have a few minutes to address questions. And Meryl, I'd turn it over to you to go through the number of questions that have come in and provide the first one for our speakers.
Sure, thanks, Sarah. So we have a few questions that have come in. This one is for Tim from Thales Crivelli, is asking, considering the 30% of food loss that Pat demonstrated, does it really make sense to consider the big challenge as producing 50% more food? Why not tackle the food loss?
Well, we do in our report. So we have a major element, which is reducing food loss and waste. I don't think we have it quite estimated at that level as greenhouse gases, but for example, more or less, I mean, it's about 25% of global calories, and it's spread across. And if you reduce the food loss and waste by 25%, then you're going to save, more or less a quarter of the it's going to be like 10 or 15% of your emissions, and so it's a big part of our proposal. But it's not that easy to reduce food loss and waste as people think. And the reason is it's not one person that is losing 25 or 30% of all the food. There might be maybe 6 or 7 handlers in each step of the process between getting food from the field to a person's consumption. And each step, typically there's only a few percent lost. So any one company, any one person, with some exceptions, is only losing a few percent. So it's not that easy to increase the efficiency. There are areas of high loss. So American consumers are unbelievably wasteful. That's an example. But as a whole, it's going to be hard to achieve. So we basically think a realistic target is 25%, And perhaps with extraordinary success and new technologies, maybe we could get to 50%. And that's important, but it's only one of many things. If you didn't increase yields, by the way, everything would be lost. Our gap, where we assume 15 gigatons in 2050, assumes historic rates of yield growth. And without those, as I said, you're near 40 gigatons. So productivity gains in all scenarios is still the single most important factor.
Thank you. And Meryl, I think we have time for just one more quick question for tech that's come in.
Sure. So this question is from Daniel Fuentes, Tech. And the question is, what do you mean by financial barriers of the full mitigation potential via consumption of healthy and sustainable diets? And would you mind sharing some examples with us?
Thank you, Meryl. By financial barrier, I mean that it is easy to say that shifting from animal-based food to plant-based food is easy, but there are some cultural things, and also there are a lot of growers. They are already in that business of animal-based food production, and then it's not that easy to. It's not going to happen over time, and it takes time for them to get out of that business and give the alternative. So there are quite a few examples. There are a lot of examples around that. So that's what I mean. It's not only the attitude, cultural and food habit, but also the livelihood of many people who are depending their livelihood on the animal raising and animal-based food production. Thank you.
And Meryl, I think we, due to time, do need a final slide today. And I want to thank everyone for tuning in and joining today's webinar, with a special thank you to Meryl Richards, Tech Sepkoda, and Tim Searchinger for your excellent presentations. We've heard...
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
For many that you're interested in receiving a recording and slides, and we'll follow up after today's discussion to make those resources available to you. We also want to let all of you know that we have a great deal of research and material available about climate change and deforestation on engagethechain.org, which you'll see on the slide. So we encourage you to view and access the information on that resource. For the many of you who have answered questions that unfortunately we couldn't get to today, we'll send those to our speakers, who will be able to follow up with you separately.